I never imagined inheriting 680 acres of land would turn into the biggest nightmare of my life. But that's exactly what happened. Imagine waking up one morning to find that the entire homeowners association was essentially living on your property, treating it like it belonged to them, and then doubling the rent on everything overnight without asking. I never expected to be on the phone with police, fighting over land that was legally mine. It felt like something out of a story, except this was my life, and I was stuck right in the middle of it. Before I even realized what was happening, my quiet country inheritance had turned into the ultimate HOA drama zone, and the chaos had only just begun. Before we dive in, if you enjoy real-life neighborhood drama and crazy HOA stories, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Stories Daily. I post stories like this all the time, and you won't want to miss the next one. Trust me, if you've ever dealt with a Karen who thinks she runs the world, this story will hit close to home. It all started when my grandfather passed away. He left me 680 acres of land in a rural area, mostly open fields, a few scattered barns, and a small cluster of homes he had rented to long-term tenants. It was a huge inheritance, and at first, I was overwhelmed by the responsibility. I thought about turning it into a quiet retreat, maybe a place to go hunting, or just get away from city life on the weekends. I never expected to find myself in a full-blown war with an HOA. The land had a few homes that my grandfather had been renting out. Tenants were happy, had lived there for decades, and paid a reasonable amount for rent. Everything had been running smoothly until I inherited the property. Almost immediately, a representative from the HOA showed up at my property. She introduced herself with a clipboard in hand and an air of authority. That immediately made me uneasy. Her name, as I would soon find out, was Karen. I already had a feeling from the stories I had heard online about HOA Karens, but nothing could have prepared me for the experience that was about to unfold. Karen started by insisting that the HOA had certain rights over parts of my property. She claimed that because the land had houses that were part of the association, I had to follow the HOA's rules, pay HOA fees, and allow them to manage certain areas as they saw fit. I politely tried to explain that I had just inherited the land, that my grandfather had never been involved with the HOA beyond basic communications, and that I was the legal owner of the property. Karen smiled politely as if she understood, but I could tell from her tone that she had no intention of listening. It was clear she expected me to simply go along with whatever the HOA demanded. Within days of that first visit, things escalated. Karen sent letters to me, some official-looking and some threatening, claiming that I owed back HOA fees for every house and plot on my property. She also demanded that I sign agreements giving the HOA management authority over the land. I tried to read through the letters carefully, but the language was confusing and intimidating. Some of it sounded legitimate, but other parts seemed clearly overreaching. I decided to consult with a lawyer to understand my rights, but in the meantime, Karen had already started taking action. The first major shock came when I discovered that the HOA had doubled the rent for my tenants without notifying me. I had inherited these tenants under legal contracts that my grandfather had set up decades ago. They had been paying a set rent every month, which was fair, and I never had any complaints then. Almost overnight, I started receiving emails and calls from tenants saying they had been informed by the HOA that the rent had increased by 100%. They were confused, scared, and angry. I called the HOA immediately to ask what was going on. Karen answered, and she calmly told me that it was standard procedure, and that since the land was within the HOA jurisdiction, she had the authority to adjust rents. I was stunned. My lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. She had no legal right to change the tenants' contracts or rent amounts. It was my property, my contracts, and my tenants' rights were protected under state law. But confronting her about it proved more difficult than I expected. Tensions escalated further when I attempted to go to the property to meet with the tenants and sort out the situation. Karen had sent out notices that I wasn't allowed on certain areas of the property without HOA approval. She claimed that certain common areas belonged to the HOA and that I was trespassing. I couldn't believe it. I was the owner of the land, and now I was being told I couldn't even walk across my own property in certain areas. It was surreal, and at this point, the situation was starting to feel like it could get ugly. Within a week, things boiled over. One afternoon, I went to the property to speak with my tenants directly and ensure that no rent changes were enforced until the legal situation was clarified. Karen showed up along with 2 other HOA members, blocking access to the houses. She was aggressive, loud, and unapologetic. She refused to let me enter the property and began taking pictures of me, while insisting that I was violating HOA rules. The tenants were watching from their porches, confused and frustrated. I tried to explain calmly that I own the land, and that they were within their legal rights as tenants. But Karen interrupted every sentence with her own version of the rules. At that point, I realized this would not be a conversation I could win with polite words alone. It got worse when a neighbor called the police. They had witnessed the confrontation and, assuming the HOA had authority, thought they were enforcing the rules correctly. Within 15 minutes, police officers arrived. I tried to explain that I was the legal owner of the property, that the tenants' contracts had not changed, and that Karen had no authority to double rents or restrict access. The officers looked confused, as they had never dealt with an HOA overreach like this before. Karen, on the other hand, presented her documents and statements as if they were unquestionable. There was a tense standoff, with me trying to assert my rights, Karen insisting on HOA authority, and the police mediating between us. It was surreal. I felt like I was in a movie, except this was real life, and the stakes were incredibly high. Over the next few weeks, I began documenting every interaction, every letter, every email, every phone call. I even hired a property lawyer specializing in HOA disputes to handle communication on my behalf. Karen continued to push boundaries, sending notices, attempting to collect fees, and even threatening legal action. But with the legal team on my side, I was able to counteract every move. Letters were sent clarifying that I owned the land, that the HOA had no authority to alter leases or collect fees on my behalf, and that any attempts to interfere could result in legal consequences. Karen tried to challenge each letter, but my lawyer was prepared, and eventually she had to slow down. It was clear that she hadn't anticipated having someone on the other side who was well-informed and determined. At the same time, I focused on maintaining relationships with the tenants. I personally met with each family to reassure them that no rent increases would be enforced until the situation was fully resolved. I explained that the HOA had no legal authority over my property, and that they were protected by their contracts. This was crucial because if the tenants had panicked and left, it could have created additional complications. Slowly, the situation began to stabilize, though Karen continued to appear occasionally, trying to assert control, but less aggressively than before. Finally, after months of back and forth, formal legal notices, and repeated clarification, the HOA had to back down. The lawyer sent a final notice stating that any future attempts to interfere with the property, tenants, or contracts would be considered harassment. Karen could no longer enforce rents, block access, or claim control over the land. Peace was restored, at least for the time being. I had successfully asserted my rights, protected my tenants, and reclaimed full control of the 680 acres my grandfather had left me. Looking back, it was an unbelievable ordeal. The combination of inherited property, aggressive HOA management, and tenants caught in the middle created a perfect storm of tension and drama. I learned a lot about property law, tenant rights, and just how far a Karen can push before reality catches up with her. The experience taught me to never underestimate how complex property disputes can become, even on land that legally belongs to you. If you've ever dealt with a situation like this, or know someone who has had a conflict with an HOA or an entitled neighbor, share your story in the comments below. I want to hear about your experiences. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, share it with a friend who loves real-life drama, and subscribe to Karen's Stories Daily for more stories where entitled neighbors, HOA presidents, and Karens learn the hard way that you can't just take control of someone else's property.